Good afternoon and good morning. I'd like to thank you all for joining in today's webinar on Excel pivot tables, which will be presented by Greg Lutz, who's the Senior Technical Trainer for us here at ctc TrainCanada. The audio for the session today will be via integrated VoIP, and I see a lot of you look like you've already connected. I'm just going to give some time for more people to access the audio portion. I'm going to check on the attendees to make sure that people are in the audio. All right, so hopefully people can view this slide and get their audio connected. Today, for feedback, if you go to your participant panel on the right-hand side, you can find some the feedback options. If you're having any troubles, you can use the raise hand tool, which looks like a little hand in the air, and we will get back to you via the chat box. You might also be asked at points throughout the presentation to give us feedback. At this point, I would like you to locate your feedback options on the participant panel. And if you could change your feedback to a little green check mark for yes, so that I know you can see and hear the presentation. Great, I'm seeing lots of green check marks, a few hands up. We will get back to you in a moment to help you out. Great, that's wonderful. So based on the results, I'm going to continue ahead. If you have any questions during the session, please use the Q&A panel and enter your question, and please send it to all panelists so that we can get back to you. We will compile the questions, and time permitting at the end, we will answer them. Should we not get to your question, we will get back to you via email after the session is done. Just a little bit about ctc TrainCanada. We have been around since 1989 and are a Microsoft Gold Learning Partner with 11 facilities in major cities across the country. We have a great guarantee to run philosophy, so rest assured that if you book a class with us, we will do everything to make sure it runs on schedule. And we have lots of key partners in the industry. You can see them here. And about your presenter, Greg Lutz. He will be delivering the session today, and I am now going to pass the mic over to Greg to take you through Excel pivot tables.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. Obviously, I'm your instructor. My name is Greg, and today's class, we're going to take a look at pivot tables. If you do have any questions, as Laura said, you can use the Q&A that's there, and we will try to respond as soon as possible. For now, let's take a look at how we make a pivot table. I'll switch over to Excel here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to share this out so that you guys will be able to actually see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to actually share my whole desktop here. It'll take a minute, but within a minute or so, what you should have in front of you is my Microsoft Excel 2010. You'll notice the data that's in front of me here is very typical. I have a salesperson, I have a territory, there's a quarter, sales, expense, profit. A lot of times when you have data that looks like this, it's a little hard to organize it. If I want to figure out what the total sales was for the first quarter, it's not that straightforward to look at this and be able to tell what the sales, expenses, or profit was for the first quarter. If I want to take a look at sales per territory, it also makes it quite difficult because it's not all kind of organized, so I could easily use like a sum formula. I may have to use multiple sum formulas, or I may have to use more of an intelligent sum formula to do some of that counting for me. However, the data that you need is going to have to look exactly like this. You need labels, so you need text, but you also need numbers as well. If you try to do a pivot table with just text, you might be quite disappointed in exactly the way that it's going to look when you're finished. When you work with text, the only thing you can really do is count it. And it's tough to average it. You can't multiply it really. A lot of times, all you can do is count it. So you need numbers. Once you have numbers, then you know you can build a pivot table. And as I said, the data has to be set up like this. All the labels have to be across the top, and your data has to sit underneath it. If it doesn't look like this, you may have to massage the data a little bit, clean it up, in order for it to look exactly like this. There's another thing that you have to look at as well, and that has more to do with a function that's in Excel. This new function is called Format as Table, but it does a lot more than just format it as a table. So before you build a chart, a graph, or a pivot table, what you have to do is take your data, make it into a table. The reason that you do that is because it's very possible that this table may grow. If the table grows, then the addresses are going to change, right? Your range changes. Normally when you build something, a chart, a graph, pivot table, even a formula, a lot of times it asks for a range. So you put in A1 to whatever it is, and that is generally your range. But the problem is that if the range grows, you're going to have to rebuild the pivot table or rebuild the chart. So to avoid doing that, you build it as a table. If I highlight the table that's here, all I have to do is use a button called Format as Table. It sits on your Home tab, and it's a little more than halfway through the tab. If I click on Format as Table, there's all these different formats that I can choose. I'll choose one format, and it'll format it. This is a range, and it's asking me where the data for my table actually sits. Well, it sits from A1 to F17. It also asks me if my table has headers. The reason the check mark is already there is because it does understand that I have labels that go all the way across the top. So it sees text. So since I have text, it checks it off. All I got to do is click OK. When I click OK, it gives the table a name. You'll also notice that your toolbars change. You're now working with table tools. You're in the Design tab, and your table name sits in the upper left-hand side. Table 2. I have a lot that I can do with this table. As you can see, I can export it. I got a check mark for a total row that's here. I can remove the headings if I need to. And you'll also notice that the headings have drop-downs. So it makes it easy for us to sort, filter, pretty much do anything we want to the data. So I now have added functionality. Now to build my pivot table. To build my pivot table, up top, you'll notice that there's a button. It's called Summarize with Pivot Table. All I have to do is click it. That's it. Once I click Summarize with Pivot Table, it then asks me, where's the pivot table? It's looking for a table or a range. So it's looking for a name or a range. Table 2. Perfect. It's not a range. Therefore, if table 2 grows, I don't have to redo the pivot table. Table 2 will always be table 2, no matter how many columns or rows get added. The next choice is to choose whether or not you want to put this on a brand new sheet or an existing worksheet. I usually put it on a new worksheet. I mean, you have an unlimited amount of sheets now, so you might as well use them. All I have to do, once again, is click OK. Once I click OK, I can choose which fields to add to my pivot table. I notice that my pivot table has a name, I can refresh it. I can change the source. I can even make a chart out of it. So I've got a button for that. On the right-hand side is the pivot table field list. If I click the pull-down arrow, this is showing me just the areas only. I want to see the fields and the areas. So I click on Fields section and Areas section. Now I see my fields and I see the different sections of the pivot table. The report filter used to be known as the page filter. So normally this is something that repeats itself in the table, but not too often, kind of like a quarter, or might even be a person's name, depending on how often the names are repeated. Your column labels, this is everything that you want to go into the columns. So everything that you want to go across the table, that sits in column labels. For row labels, obviously, this is the data that you want to go down by rows. And values, well, normally, the only thing you should be putting there are numbers. So sales, expense, and profit all go into values. It's up to you to decide where the rest of the different fields go. So for instance, I can grab salesperson. I can click on salesperson and drag salesperson right to the row labels. All of the salespeople's names show up. I can then decide to see their sales. To see their sales, I can click on sales and drag sales to values. Now I see everyone's sales and I get to see the salesperson's name. I can now add more information. For instance, I could organize things by the territory. I'd like to see which salespeople are in what territories. So I click on territory and I drag territory and I drop it above salesperson. You'll notice that there's this little gray line that kind of follows you around. It's very, very subtle. Right now the gray line is underneath salesperson. If I move it just above, you'll see that the gray line follows me. And now it's going to drop territory above salesperson. Now it's organized. Not only is it organized, but I also have a sum for the east, for the north, for the south, and for the west. And I also have a grand total. Right now, the numbers may not exactly mean anything, mainly because they're not formatted. If you wish to format the numbers, put a $sign in front of them, you can go back to home, and just like normal, you can go ahead and you can highlight all the numbers and format them in accounting style. All I have to do is go back to home and click on my $sign. Now it's properly formatted, and it looks good too. I can still add more. For instance, I can add the quarter. So now I'd like it broken down by quarter. I can take quarter and I can squeeze it in between territory and salesperson. Now I see the east and all the different quarters in the east. I see the north and all the different quarters in the north. If I don't like the way that it looks, I can still reorganize it. Nothing that you do in the pivot table is ever carved in stone. So I can take quarter and I can drag it, say, above territory. Now when I drag it above territory, it's organized it by quarter. For the first quarter, this is the sales for the east, for the north, for the west. For the second quarter, east, north, south, and west. I can add more data in, like expenses and profit now. I can grab expenses and drop it underneath the sum of sales. I can take profit and drag profit underneath the sum of expenses. Right now, the pivot table looks pretty darn busy. That's just because the way that we've organized it, I only have a single salesperson for each quarter, and it changes all the time. So a better spot for quarter is the report filter, the page filter. If I take quarter, I can drop quarter into the report filter. Now the quarter sits at the top, and I'm looking at all of the quarters. If I wish to see the first quarter, all I have to do is click the pull-down arrow where it says All, and change it to First. Now I just see the first quarter sales. If I want to see the second quarter sales, all I have to do is change the page filter again and change it to second. When you click off to the side, you lose your pivot table features. You'll notice the toolbar up top goes away. When you click back into the pivot table, all those tools come back. I have options, and I also have a tab for design as well. If you want to see all your different options for the pivot table, all you have to do is click on Options. If you want to change the design of the pivot table, you click on your Design tab, and these are all the different things that you can work with for design. Right now I have subtotals. That's the first button. I can tell it not to show me subtotals. If I click on Do Not Show Subtotals, I don't see any subtotals, only a grand total. I can show all the subtotals at the bottom of a group, or I can show all the subtotals at the top of the group. It just depends on the way that you want to organize the pivot table. It also depends on the purpose of the pivot table too. Are you focused on the quarters, or is it more the sales people that you're focused on? I'll switch this back to all, just so I have all my numbers back. Your grand totals. You can turn off the grand totals for the rows only, or just for the columns. So once again, you decide how you want to lay it out. The report layout, you can show it in compact form. I can show it in outline form. I can also show it in tabular form. And I can repeat all of the item labels. These are some of the minor things that you can do to pivot tables to change the look and the feel of the pivot table. Another interesting option is the ability to insert a blank line after every item. Creates a bit of separation. Might look a little less busy. I'll tell it do not repeat the item labels. And that cleans up a little bit more. I have other options that I can use, whether or not I see row headers. Bolds it, changes it a little bit, my column headers. Treats them a little bit differently. I could have banded rows. I could also have banded columns. And then I have this whole little section here for different styles. When you hover over top of a style, it takes a moment, but it then applies the style. This is an auto preview feature that you have with a lot of different things in this version. You've got some very interesting styles, medium, dark, and you can even create your own pivot table styles as well. So if you don't like the colors that are here or the way that they've done certain things, you can make your own style. I'll click off to the side, and I'll get out of there. There are some limitations, though. Let me go back to sheet 1. This is my pivot table. I'll actually label it pivot table here. And sheet 1, I'll label as data. Now when I come back to sheet 1, what we did is we took a bunch of data and we made a table out of it. But there's an issue with that, and it has to do with sharing. Let me show you what I mean. Up top, if you want to do anything with data, you head to Data. So this is where I can turn certain things off that have been turned on automatically, like my filter, for instance. If I don't want the filter turned on, I can remove it. Not a problem. If I head to Review, though, inside Review is where you share your workbook. It's towards the end. There's a little button there, Share Workbook. But you'll notice that there's a couple of options that are usually lit up that are no longer lit up. You cannot protect and share a workbook, nor can you track changes in a workbook that has a table. Back at home, we used a button called Format as Table. When you use that button, in the Review tab, it disables the ability to protect and share the workbook as well as track changes. So you have to decide. If these features are really important to you, then you can't use tables, and you'll have to go back to using a range. If these features are not so important to you, then you can continue to use tables because you're not worried about sharing the workbook or tracking changes that happen within the workbook. If you do want to change this back to a range, let me walk you through that. To set this back to a range, I have to go back to my table tools. In my table tools, there is a tab called Design. In the Design tab, what you're used to working with is what's known as a range. I can click anywhere in the table and then click on my button, Convert to Range. It'll ask me again, are you sure you want to convert this to a normal range? And when I say yes, those features now come back. I can now head to Review, and in Review, once I save this, I'll be able to protect and share my workbook once again. I'll go back to Home, I'll re-highlight this, and I'll turn it back into a table. It's important to know how to get stuff back. And this is a simple way of going back and forth, converting to a range or creating a table out of it. Let me head back to the pivot table. Your pivot table is not exactly finished or done at this point. It's interactive. You can actually double-click on different areas and either expand the information or create a whole new table out of it. For instance, here I have this sum of sales for my East. Right, 9,000. If I double-click on that 9,000, it creates a brand new sheet. It creates a brand new table. What it does is it breaks down and shows me how we came up with that 9,000 in sales. So it's as if you're drilling into the pivot table and you're getting more information out of the pivot table. You're extracting things. In a presentation, this is quite impressive. If somebody wants to know how you get that total for the North, all you have to do is double-click on it. My West, my East. Here I've got the North, right? If I double-click on North, it just collapses it. The same as clicking on the plus. So, it's interactive. Want to see the sum of expenses? Same thing, I just double-click. Creates a brand new sheet. I'm now on sheet 8 just because of all the sheets that I already have, and it breaks down exactly how we got to that. So pivot tables, they're interactive. You can do a lot of different things with them. The other thing I want to do is create a data source, an external data source. The easiest way to do it is by using something like Access. You could use another spreadsheet, and that's possible too. But if it's an external data source, a lot of times it's usually a database. So let's give that a shot. I want to connect to an external data source, and I want to build a table out of it. First, let me show you the data source that I'm talking about. The data source that I'm talking about is a Access database, Northwind. It's kind of a common database. We use it for teaching. It's not a perfect database, and that's one of the reasons that we actually do use it for teaching. There's different flaws and things that are in it. For example, here I've got, let's see, product sales for 1995. So obviously, these are my sales for chai tea, for Chang, aniseed syrup, all kinds of stuff, vegetable spread, chocolate, not sure. You've got a bunch of different things that are in here. But it's hard to tell what I have in sales for seafood. It's tough to see what I have for meat, grains. It's tough for me to get a grand total for all this. So what I want to do, build a pivot table out of it. So I'll close the database down, and I'll head back to Excel. I'll go to Sheet 2, and I want to build a pivot table. So easy enough. I'll go to Insert. Inside Insert is where you'll find Pivot Table. There's two parts to the button: Pivot Table and a Pivot Chart. I want to build a pivot table. So I'll click on Pivot Table. It then asks me, well, you can select the table or range, and, well, I don't have one in this sheet. It's external. So I have to use an external data source. Now I have to choose the connection. And this is how we create an external data source. When I click on Choose Connection, it bugs me and asks me, well, what connection do you want? Unfortunately, I don't have any connections for the one that I want. These are all my connections, and at the bottom, I can browse for more. So this shows me all the connections that I have, and this one helps me browse for more connections. When I browse for new connections, it really just repeats the connections that you already have. These connections are actually found within your libraries, but I want to create a new one. This new one is going to access a Microsoft Access database. So I have to click on New Source. You may not be able to do this at work. You might need IT's help. Sometimes they lock people out of stuff like this. So this is kind of a common thing that we would normally lock down on a user's PC. If you click on New Source, it's kind of like a little wizard. It's a data connection wizard that walks me through everything. So it asks me, is it SQL? Is it an Odbc connection? Is it a Microsoft Access? Is it something else? So I can say, yeah, it's Microsoft Data Access. I'll hit Next. It'll ask me for my server name, and it may ask me for a username and a password. Since this is a standalone database, I don't have to use any of that stuff. So instead, I'm going to use Other. When I hit Other, I have all kinds of different data sources that show up. I want Microsoft Access. This is the provider. That's the connection. I also have advanced things that I can do, access permissions to read and write, and, well, this shows me everything. Let me hit Cancel. I want to back up just once. The other connection that you have is an Odbc connection. If I hit Next, this is going to allow you to connect to all kinds of different types of things. DBase files, Excel files, Microsoft Access database files, and Visio files. So depending on the type of file, you're going to have to choose different types of connection or data sources. I'll keep this nice and simple. I'll just use my Microsoft Access database, and I'll hit Next. It then bugs me and asks me to navigate to where it is. It's actually sitting on a separate drive here. And there's Northwind. It can be read-only. I can open it up exclusively, which means that nobody else is going to be able to add anything to the database. I'm not actually going to do any of that. I'll just click OK. It then asks me, do you want to connect to a specific table? Some of these are tables, and some of these are queries. It tells you the type on the right-hand side. If it's a query, it's also known as a view. In different databases, instead of calling them queries, they call them views. There's that product sales for 1995 that we took a look at. So that's the one that I want. And I'll hit next. I can give it a name. I can give it a description, keywords, all kinds of different things. I don't really have to do anything to this at this point. All I have to do is hit finish. So now that I've selected a data source, I then decide, do I want to put this in a new sheet or an existing sheet? There's nothing that sits on sheet 2 right now, so I might as well use the existing sheet. And click OK. Now it's up to me to build it. I can grab the category name, product name, and the product sales. If I wish to format it, there is another way of formatting it. When you click into the pivot table, up top, it'll tell you what the active field is, the field that you're working in. So if I click on my sum of product sales, it tells me that I'm working with sum of product sales. If I don't want to sum or I want to change the format of this, all I have to do is click on Field Settings. When I click on Field Settings, this gives me the ability to choose count, average, min, max, product. There's loads. Sum's fine with me. The number format, if I click on number format, this allows me to change the formatting. Instead of it being general, I could change it to, say, accounting. Pick the number of decimal places, as well as the symbol that I use. When I click OK, all I have to do is click OK again, and it reformats it. Any questions so far? Now there's a new feature that's only found within 2010. It's called a slicer. When you're working inside of a pivot table, one of the choices that you have to sort and filter is this thing called a slicer. It's brand new for 2010. You can use it for a lot of different things, but basically, it's a filter. If I go to Insert Slicer, all I have to do is choose Insert Slicer and choose what it is that I want to be able to filter by. Category name probably makes the most sense. When I click OK, I now get a beautiful table that I can use to filter the information on the left-hand side. So if I just want to see seafood, all I have to do is click right on top of seafood, and it changes. Now I'm just looking at seafood. If I want to see meat, I just click on meat, and now it shows me meat. If you want to choose more than one, use your Control key. Your Control key allows you to select more than one item. It may take a second, but eventually, it filters and shows you the information that you chose. If I click off to the side, my pivot table tools go away, but the slicer stays. This is terrific for people that are not so comfortable with pivot tables. As long as they've got something to click on, it makes it fairly easy for them to sort and to filter. And if they're not used to using pivot tables, you may want to take some of these options away from them, like the drop-down at the top to be able to filter and sort, or the little pluses and minuses, so they don't actually accidentally collapse something and not realize that they've collapsed it. To take some of those features away, you've got to go back to your pivot table options, and it's towards the end. You have all these different buttons that are depressed. Field list, plus minus, and field headers. So, since those buttons are depressed, if you want to remove functionality, all you got to do is make that depressed button happy again. I click on it, and I lose all the pluses and minuses. I can't collapse anything. My field headers, I can remove those too. And my field list. I still have my pivot table options in front of me. It's just that I've lost all these visuals. I can add my field list back, the plus and minus buttons, and my headers, or my headings. Also, with these headings, right now it says row labels, and that looks kind of ugly. You can change most of the labels that you see. If I click on row labels, I can just type in categories. Sum of product sales, I can just put in total sales. That way, it looks a little nicer. Those headings actually mean something to us, and might be a little bit easier to read for other people that may not be familiar with using a pivot table. You don't always have to use pivot tables. There are intelligent formulas that you can use that will total this stuff up. As I said in the beginning, trying to total up the territory, the quarter, and the sales can be really, really difficult. So you've got different formulas that do help you out. For instance, the last formula, or the one that I want to show you, it's called Sumif. Let's see. I'll click into I1. I'll type in north total, and then I'll put the formula right beside it. The formula starts out equals sum if, and then an opening bracket. It then asks me for the range, the criteria that I'm looking for, and the sum range. So, the range, well, the range is going to be from, let's see, B2 all the way down to D17. Because I'm using a table, take a look at my range. Take a look at what it's put in there. It puts in the table's name, followed by a bracket, a squared bracket. Field names, when you work with databases, in queries, a lot of times you put the field names inside squared brackets. So it's almost as if table 3 is like a formula. First, there's a bracket that goes around the names, and then there's a bracket around each name. Whenever you see a colon in a formula or programming or anything like that on a computer, it always means 2. That never changes. So, territory to sales. That's the range. Perfect. I can now throw in a comma. The criteria that I want, well, that's easy. Opening quotation mark, north, spelled correctly. Spelling matters. I'll throw in a comma, and now for the sum range. The sum range that I want is really just sales. So I can highlight all the way from D2 to D17. Once again, it puts in table, opening bracket, sales. I don't need a second set of brackets because we're not putting in a range. We're only putting in, I mean, we are putting in a range, but we're not putting in more than one range. So, since it's not more than one range, I can just type in sales just like that. I close my bracket and hit my Enter key. The total for the north is 7,500. To double check it, I can use my control key just to click on one, the next one, the next one, and the next one. And at the very bottom of my screen, I should see the count, numerical count, the minimum number, the maximum number, and the total, which is 7,500. That is pivot tables in a nutshell. I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation, and I hope you picked a couple of tips and tricks for creating pivot tables here and there. Thank you very much.
Greg?
Yes.
Sorry, I see that there's 2 questions. I don't know if you have a minute to just see if you can answer them.
Absolutely.
Can you see them in your Q&A, or do you want me to read them to you?
No, it's will notes be supplied?
Oh, I have different ones. Oh, there's more.
Oh.
I've got a question here that says, can we have multiple slicers?
Yes, you can have multiple slicers. If I click into it here, I'll go back to my pivot table options. I'll choose slicer. I could have one for salesperson, territory, quarter. Doesn't make sense to have it for the numbers, but for all the different text, for all the labels, no problem at all. I can check off a whole bunch. You can even format the slicers so that they all look different, right? Make this one this color, make this one orange, or I don't know, make it a little bit more dramatic. So yes. And it's not just pivot tables. I can also use slicers for charts and graphs too. So they're very interesting to play with. The other question was, are your pivot tables automatically updated when the database has new information? Another really good question. If I click into my pivot table, if I head to options, inside options, there's a little refresh button that's here. I can refresh the pivot table, or I can hit refresh all. Just real quick, slicer is only found in 2010. It's one of the only options that is not found in any previous versions. It is only found in 2010. It's just a brand new thing that they had. So I've got to hit refresh button to refresh the data. I can also go into the pivot table options that are here. And in the pivot table options, you've got a bunch of different things that kind of help you to merge, center. There's some just different tools and things. If I head to data, there is one thing that I can check off, which is to refresh the data every time I open the file. Any other questions? Good questions.
I think that's it.
Excellent.
Well, there's a few more coming in here, so we'll compile them and we'll get back to these people that are still entering questions. I'll stay online for a few more minutes. But ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the audio portion of our presentation today, and we will compile the questions. And we also will have a recording of the webinar up on our website, and we can send out a link to that as well. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you everybody. We will be ending the event now. Thank you very much and have a great day.